Hi Helen, how are you?
Hi, Peter. I'm fine, thanks. How are you doing?
Good, thanks. Thank you so much for joining. Helen is with us today. We're recording an interview, and the interview is about the Power Up project that many of you across Homestart will have known about. But it's a project that ran for 3 years, and Dr. Helen Kara of We Research It Limited has evaluated the project. And so, as well as sharing the report with the Homestart network, we thought it might be fun to have a conversation about the project and about the evaluation and see what we learned. And so um, uh, I'm here to ask a few questions of Helen, and Helen has been given total permission to say absolutely everything that she saw and felt about the project. And I guess from our end, this is about trying to learn from the project. It was a very important project for Homestart UK and for the network, and it felt like we learned a lot through the process. And so, particularly as we are embarking on a strategy development piece right now, it felt timely to ask Helen to share her views. So, Helen, does that sound all right? Are you happy to answer a few questions?
Sounds great. And yes, I will.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you. So, before we start on Power Up, do you want to tell us a bit about you and your background and what you do with projects like this?
Well, I'm an independent researcher and evaluator, which means I'm self-employed. I've been doing that for over 20 years. And I also write and teach about research and evaluation methods and ethics. So it's a bit of a specialism of mine, I guess. And I do a lot of work with third sector organisations. I really like working with the third sector, with national organisations like yourself, also with regional organisations and local organisations. So I like that mix of levels. And of course, at Homestart, you kind of get the two in one, because I'm working with Homestart UK, which is national right across the UK, but also I've been working with local Homestarts on the evaluation, getting information from them and talking to them about what they've been doing and how it's been for them and all that kind of thing, which has been really, really interesting.
And had you heard of Homestart before the Power Up project then? Had you come across Homestart's work?
Yeah, I absolutely had. I used to work with Sure Start, which some people will remember as the predecessor of children's centres. I started working with the Sure Start unit in 2000, helping partnerships around the country, mostly in the East and West Midlands, to set up Sure Start partnerships. And if there was a local Home Start, then the manager of that local Home Start would always be on the Sure Start partnership. That was where I first really got to know about Home Start. I worked with Home Start UK in about 2003-04. I referred a couple of my friends to Home Start when they had babies and were struggling for various reasons. And it was just lovely to be invited back to do this evaluation. I mean, I say invited, actually there was an application process and I was interviewed and I was selected. So it wasn't kind of some nepotistic thing, but it was really lovely to come back and work with Home Start again. I've enjoyed it a lot.
Brilliant. It's lovely to have you back. And so when you looked at the project, the Power Up project, did it look, before we get into the project, did it look like something that would be straightforward to evaluate, or did it sort of pose any particular challenges or questions?
It looked as though it would be reasonably straightforward. Often these kinds of projects look more straightforward from the beginning of a 3-year run than they do from the end. But that helps because the complexity sort of builds up and you can absorb it bit by bit. It looked reasonably straightforward, but it quickly became apparent that it was more complicated than it looked. Essentially, as soon as I started talking to local home starts, I realized that there was a lot more complexity than had at first met the eye. And that made it both more challenging and more interesting.
Which we'll no doubt dive into now. Thank you, Helen. So I guess the first thing to ask is, could you give us a summary, a 1 minute summary, a quick one of what the Power Up project was and what it was intending to do?
Initially, it was all about sustainability of local home starts through consolidation and collaboration. And this was based on a bunch of listening and talking and reflecting in very home start style that had gone on, I understand, had gone on before I got involved, before the project was set up, before the funding was secured. So it was based on some messages from the local home starts. However, I think the time lag caused some difficulty because I think it took a while to hear the messages, distill the messages, get the funding, implement the funding. And by that point, the messages had changed somewhat. So that was a bit of a problem. I think another difficulty was that Power Up was envisaged with consolidation and collaboration being taken as a fairly wide definition. So consortiums, partnerships, collaborations, mergers, but it became seen as very much an impetus for local home starts to merge. And that caused some problems too, because not all local home starts wanted to merge, and it would not have been right. Many local home starts where it would not have been right for them to merge. And I think that was understood at a central level, but I think locally, people felt that it wasn't understood. So that was a bit difficult. Another problem was that sustainability is essentially a myth. When you're talking about local home starts, which are very small, mostly very small, some are larger, but they're all still, by the Charities Commission definition, small charities. It's really a myth that they can be self-sustaining. They might be able to be for a while, but all you need is the couple of real movers and shakers on the board to move on, or a big funding pot to disappear without having been able to be replaced despite best efforts. Or one of these kind of events can happen and things can get very difficult very quickly. And really, I think through the course of the Power Up program, the understanding of that developed a lot and changed a lot, which was, I think, pretty helpful.
That's a really interesting point about sustainability and the I guess it's the pursuit that all charities are looking for, isn't it, to be sustainable? But how that happens in the real world is quite difficult. Certainly, when I started Homestart, I'd heard a bit about the Power Up project, and I got the impression it certainly had a merger and consolidation focus right at the outset, but it moved a little bit, and I think moved further as we'll discuss that in a bit. But it felt to me a partnership between Homestart trying to look at ways to be more sustainable, but also the funder, the National Lottery, looking at their landscape and saying actually it would benefit the landscape of children and family support if home starts could be more sustainable too. So that I think there were these two things that came together to create this project, which I think was asking about, okay, how do we get on and support that sustainability? So it'd be good to dive into that then. And so did you have a clear sense of sort of objectives for the project then when you started the evaluation? Was it there a fairly straightforward set of aims, or was it a bit more complicated than that?
It was a bit more complicated than that. There were different kinds of aims. I mean, one of the aims of the lottery was to reduce the dependence of local home starts on lottery funding. And there was this idea that if local home starts could become more sustainable, they'd be less dependent on lottery funding. And there is, to some extent, an argument for that, because it depends what you regard as sustainability actually meaning, what definition of sustainability you use. And we came up with a working definition, which was around having a robust forward business plan, good reserves that were sustained, diversified funding sources, and good governance. And yet I spoke to local home starts that had all of that in place, but just didn't have any money apart from their reserves, and so were risking going under. And what was pointed out to me many times very robustly by people from local home starts was, you can be as sustainable as you like, but if you haven't got funding, then sustainable doesn't exist. You can be as internally sustainable, but there's still that external pressure. And also, I could see why the lottery wanted to reduce the dependence of local home start, because the lottery, after 10 years of austerity, the lottery is spread too thin. But there are so few options. There are other options for funding, particularly in a pandemic. There are a few options, but we'll get to that later on. But even before the pandemic, the potential sources of funding for local home starts are contracting, not least because a lot have lost local authority funding, though they're still doing preventative work for local authorities and saving local authorities a lot of money in the process. But local authorities are not to blame for that, because they also are being stretched way too thin and having to make some incredibly unpalatable decisions. I mean, I've heard from local authority commissioners, not particularly in this piece of work, but in other pieces of work I've done, I've heard about tears, I've heard about sleepless nights, I've heard about, just having to make impossible decisions about whether to fund this essential service or that essential service because they can't fund them both, but both are essential. And really, with Home Start, there are never not going to be families with young children in crisis. That is never going to be eradicated, because there will always be families where there are mental health problems, where there's substance misuse, where there's, these chronic problems that as a society we're working to minimize, but we're never going to get rid, because we're people and that's how people are.
That's really fascinating. Yeah, and in that environment, even if the Home Start model and the Home Start offer is demonstrating value, demonstrating savings, demonstrating real impact on families and on lives, it's still up against everything else that councils and commissioners and funders are valuable stuff that they're looking at in other ways. So we'll dive into that too. I'm wondering, like, with that complexity of project to look at and things to try and evaluate, how on earth do you go about evaluating? Like, what's your what sort of questions are you asking at the outset, and methods are you considering?
Well, I was very lucky to work with an excellent steering group for this evaluation that was set up by Home Start UK. And involved the then chief executive, a very motivated and hands-on trustee, some of the people who were working on the Power Up programs at that time from Stepping Out. There was an academic who specializes in third sector evaluation who gave a sort of really useful, independent, kind of fresh pair of eyes sort of view on the whole thing. The lottery was represented, a couple of other people, I think. And that group came together to plan. I gave a proposal to the group, but the group came together to plan how we were going to conduct the evaluation. And we discussed lots of options for methods, but we came down to the idea that actually talking to local Home Start managers was probably the most useful and most sensible thing to do, to get their perspective. And I also talked to the consultants who worked on Power Up, who worked with those local organizations. And everything was very transparent. I made it very clear who I would be talking to, as in which types of people, not so much which individuals, but that I was talking to. The local Home Start managers knew I was also talking to the consultants and vice versa. That was very transparent. And I sent everyone the questions I wanted to ask them before they signed up to talk to me, so that they knew what it was that I wanted to know about. And they were semi-structured interviews. So the last question was always, is there anything else you want to tell me? Or anything else you think I should know? That often yielded some really interesting stuff, because even with a group of us, we weren't necessarily able to formulate a set of questions to be asked consistently that would cover all of the bases for the local Home Starts. So that was important. So I did a bunch of interviews, and then I use data analysis software. This may be a bit too much information of a nerdy kind, but I use software called NVivo and import all the information and code it and analyze it. And then I brought the findings back to the evaluation steering group for them to have a look at what I found, give their input before I finalized any reports. And I did a report for year 1, report for year 2, and a report for year 3. Which incorporated, the important bits from each one. Later one incorporated the important bits from the previous ones. And I was really impressed with the extent to which Home Start UK used those reports and learned from them and made changes. I think that's one really positive thing, because as an evaluator, that doesn't always happen.
Right.
Sometimes people argue about the reports you've offered them. Sometimes people don't like them. Sometimes people bury them. There's a huge publication bias in evaluation research. And I think it's to Home Start UK's credit that they used and publicised those reports and those findings, not as much as would have been ideal, partly at one point because of change of chief executive, and partly at another point because of a pandemic, both of which were obstacles in terms of disseminating information. And with the pandemic, obstacles to lots of other things too, as we will go on to talk about. But internally, certainly the learning was used. And I'm glad now that there's the commitment to share that more widely, because I know the people who contributed to this evaluation from local Home Starts really did want to know what was coming out of it.
Brilliant. Yeah, thank you, Helen. And we certainly are keen to share the insights, good, bad, and otherwise. I think it's helpful for us as we learn on our journey of, particularly, as I say, in the strategy period that we're embarking upon. But okay, so let's dive into the project. So it sounds there were 3 years to the project. Perhaps that sounds like there's an emerging, and well, I say sounds like I have read the report, so I'm not just guessing. But would you like to tell us a bit about the 3 years of the project? How did you see it unfolding as a project, and maybe the sort of the characteristics of each year as you saw them?
Yes, I think the first year started with a very clear vision that, as I mentioned, had built up over time and was now about to happen, which didn't really quite fit Home Start itself. I think everybody thought it would, and I think it was set up with the best intentions and with some really good people. And it did do some really good work as well. It's not like it was all rubbish or anything. I'm not trying to say that at all. But it didn't really fit. And the local Home Starts were in motion, as always they are and will be. And austerity was biting harder and harder and harder. And I was surprised to find that a number of the local Home Starts I was working with in year one were already post-merger, that they had already consolidated and collaborated. I thought I would be working with local Home Starts who were moving into more consolidated, moving into consortia or moving into mergers, but some were already consortia or were post-merger and still needing quite a lot of support. And we found out quite quickly that where consultants were being briefed to go to local Home Starts and do X, Y, and Z, when they got to the local Home Starts and talked to them, they discovered that actually what was needed was not X, Y, and Z, but A, B, and C. Now, those would be different with each local Home Start. And not all of the briefs were out of alignment, but quite a number were. And this put the consultants in quite a difficult position, which most of them navigated with considerable grace and aplomb, which is to their credit. There were one or two real car crashes, which I don't think were due to anybody's incompetence or unwillingness, but just due to, there was some I think some mismatching of consultants with programs. Not much, but a little bit. But where that did happen, of course, it really didn't help. And then there were other local programs who had 2 or 3 consultants in succession, simply because sometimes a consultant had to leave for some reason, personal reasons. Things happen, illness, things in people's lives can't be helped. And sometimes because a consultant said, okay, I recognize that now you need support on this, but that's not my area, so I need to pass you over to my colleague who is much better at this than I am, which is understandable, but the local Home Starts experienced those as quite bumpy. And I think would have found it easier to be able to work consistently with one consultant across the whole process. And those who were working consistently with one consultant across the whole process found it easier and generally speaking, more use. And some of the consultants did excellent work and were very highly spoken of. So I think it's really important to make that clear. But as a complete model, it didn't fully fit. And in the second year, there was learning from that. There was more support for leadership and governance. We were still really working with this model of sustainability that was all about internal changes, not so much about looking outward for funds. But consultants were helping with fundraising because with some programs, it was just essential. By the time the consultant got to the program manager was saying, I've done all these applications, none have been successful. If you don't help me with fundraising, my program's going to go under. This is absolutely right now the top priority. And yes, I know we were going to do business planning and I know we were going to do governance, but really, if we haven't got the funding, there's no point. Consultants were saying, right, okay, and rolling their sleeves up and getting stuck in, sometimes with good, really good success. In year 2, there was, as I say, more work on leadership and governance, and a sort of softening of the kind of businessy emphasis on consolidation approach, and a bit more listening to what local Home Starts were actually needing in the moment. That was helpful. So year 2 was more positive. But then, of course, in year 3, we had a bit of a curveball in the shape of the pandemic, which arrived not long after you had taken up post, and provided a huge number of challenges, but also I think some opportunities, and certainly the opportunity to shift the Power Up support to what local programs really now absolutely desperately needed, which was fundraising support, when often fundraising avenues had been cut off. I mean, I spoke to one Home Start program where they had successfully diversified their funding streams, and they were really completely away from grant funding and into trading. And that was working superbly well until the pandemic hit and all of the trading outlets had to close overnight. and their income stopped overnight. And they obviously, then you start burning through your reserves, and that can't, even if you've got a good reserves policy and a good reserve, you're going to burn through that fairly quickly. And they were looking down the barrel of having to close the whole of their local home start, when fortunately one of the fundraising consultants was able to get a grant for them and turn it around and get it back on your feet. But 6 months before the pandemic, everybody would have been applauding that local home start for doing such a marvelous job of being self-supporting and sustainable. It does demonstrate that sustainability can be affected by many external circumstances.
So that's fascinating, isn't it? That over the pandemic, we'll dive into a bit more, but this notion of sustainability and how it's so context dependent, and so certainly my understanding of the Power Up project was that it did start with a hypothesis that consolidation and merger is a way that home starts will thrive into the future. And you look around at the landscape around family support, and it makes a lot of sense to think that, because bigger does seem better in a commissioning environment often. I guess then the reality is that of two things. One, that mergers aren't always brilliant, and they don't always sort everything out. But also, bigger. What does bigger actually mean in our context at Home Start? And so there's some things you lose about the I guess the local responsiveness of an organisation. So these things all happening at once. So as it's great for me to hear how the project recognised that, listened to it, and adapted into year two, and sort of got closer to the needs. I'm also struck when you described the sort of how the consultants that had the best effect with Home Start. You describe a relational, non-judgmental relationship, a sort of good matching process, sort of good sort of trust. It sounds somewhat like the Home Start model to me in terms of what we do with families. But anyway, that's an aside. So we've had year one, year two. We've worked with quite a few home starts along the way, some with merger, and then into year two a bit more around leadership and governance and other support and fundraising support. And then the pandemic hits, and it certainly at that moment, I remember us having a meeting on one of the few meetings I had when I started before we locked down, where we were just sort of thinking about where the project goes and how to really make year three work well. And we were discussing some of this, and then obviously the pandemic fast tracked it a bit. What do you think that the Power Up project responded as well as any project might in the face of that pandemic? Was there, what happened, what changed about how it was working?
I'm not sure it's the Power Up project as such. I think it was Home Start as a whole. I think the response of Home Start to the pandemic was pretty much exemplary when it comes to third sector responses. And I'm basing this largely on anecdotal evidence, but quite a lot of anecdotal evidence, talking to people who've been working with other third sector organisations and have said, oh, they really struggled and they didn't do this and they didn't do that. But Home Start UK seemed to get a very quick grip on what was needed and pivot a whole load of stuff while pivoting all its own operations to home working and everything online. Also managed to set up the programme of webinars to redirect all the funding. I mean, I very quickly got a message saying, right, Power Up is now going to be full on with fundraising because that's what's needed. And I just thought, yeah, absolutely, that's what's needed. I mean, let's forget talking about mergers and things for now, because mergers will always be an option for local home starts. And I'm sure in the future there will be some local home starts that do choose to merge for their own good reasons. And I think Home Start UK will be in a better position to help that process along now. But for the majority of local home starts, that's not where they want and need to go. What they want to do is support their local community and keep their organisation running and stable. I think stable is probably a better word than sustainable. I think we're aiming for stability of organisations now.
Fewer letters as well.
Yes, it's always good. It's always good. And actually, looking at local home starts, the move to consolidation predated Power Up by quite a long way. I mean, in the end of March 2016, there were 269 local home starts. 5 years later, there were 187. So it had dropped by about 80. Now, that doesn't mean that all of 80 local home starts closed or left the network. A lot of that is about consolidation, but sometimes it's consolidation. I mean, I was talking to in year 2, I was talking to two, I won't name them, two neighbouring local home starts who were really little. Like one of them, I think they possibly had just into 6-figure type budgets, you know, starting with a 100 and something. So that's really small for a charity. And they could see that if they joined forces, they could be more effective for their local area together, which wouldn't have made a massive area. So we're not trying to make some into huge conglomerates here. There will always be scope for that. But I think in year 3, Home Start responded so well to the pandemic. Home Start UK did. And I think the Power Up was just a part of that process and a part of that response, and was very much in harmony with, as you say, the Home Start ethos. Your network, your local Home Starts were in crisis. Home Start UK gave the Home Start response to local organisations in crisis, a bit like local organisations give to families in crisis. It's like, what do you need? How can we give it to you? People were available on the phone much more than they had been. I heard this from local Home Starts, that Home Start UK was more accessible, quite suddenly, quite quickly, more responsive, more supportive, more helpful. And this was partly through the webinars and the fundraising, but also through just people at Home Start UK taking the calls, spending the time, helping the local organisations with whatever it was they needed. And I really think that was exemplary.
Thank you, Helen. Yeah, I mean, it was a fascinating time, wasn't it? But I think everyone was all hands to the pump, really, across the whole network. As you say, at local level, just trying to help families, whatever we could do. Certainly at Home Start UK, that's what we were thinking about. But that's good that it sort of you felt some of that through this evaluation. So I wonder if we might dive into then whether or not the project met its aims, really. And you talked about sustainability as its sort of core aim, and we've talked a little bit about how that word might not be the most appropriate. There are also aims around collaboration and sharing learning better, and I guess how to support Home Starts more generally to be successful and to thrive. So, I mean, as you look at the evaluation, I mean, would you say, just a general question first, would you say it was a successful project? I mean, that's probably a bit too simplistic a question, but what's your reaction to the project as a whole?
I think it was successful to an extent. It was certainly successful in helping and supporting some local Home Starts in a range of different ways, including some consolidation work, including improving governance and leaderships, and including fundraising. Those are the particular ones that I would pick out. There are probably others as well. We found that Power Up, the local programs that Power Up worked with, some had got increased sustainability at the end of that process, but Power Up was rarely the only factor in that increase, because it is contextual, it is complex, and there were often other factors also in play. Like they just got some amazing volunteer who did all their fundraising that they didn't have before the Power Up project, and kind of ran alongside and helped with the sustainability. Could it be, I mean, there was an example of that, but it'd be all sorts of things. We found out a lot about the difficulty. I mean, I don't think this was really news to Home Start UK, but we did find a lot more information about the difficulty of managing a small organisation with a flat structure that constantly needs to fundraise year on year and struggles to recruit and retain volunteers. We did see signs of, I heard from local Home Starts that we're using paid staff to do work that 5 years ago would have been done by volunteers, because it's becoming much more difficult to recruit and retain volunteers. And that has its own complexity and difficulty. So I think it was to an extent successful. I don't think it really achieved the aims it set out to achieve, but I think the aims changed as the project went along. And this was with the full involvement, support and consent of the lottery who funded the whole thing. And with the evaluation steering group, the support of the evaluation steering group, because it needed to change. With projects like this and with evaluations like this, but more importantly with projects like this, there's no point setting out a plan at the start of 3 years and being determined to continue rigidly with that plan through the 3 years, come hell or high water, not in the third sector anyway, because everything changes all the time. And you need to be able to revisit at least every 6 months to relook at that and think, are we still doing the right thing? Do we need to make changes? Do we need to make tweaks? And there was such a lot of willingness to do that, rethinking, that reflection, that considering. I can't emphasize enough how helpful the evaluation steering group was with all of that. We got a much better result than if, for example, I'd just been working with one manager or with yourself or and your predecessor. Clearly you and I would be brilliant at everything, but we did get a much better result for having the other perspectives and the other input. That was really good.
I think so. Yes, we had some great people on the group. So Craig and Mark from Social Minds and Stepping Out were always very supportive, thinking about the external environment and how they're helping Homestart in that. And John Leach, of course, who is many of the network will know, was a wonderful support throughout all of it. So a couple of shout outs there. So I guess the question I have now is some key messages really. For of all the learning for Homestart UK, for local home starts and for funders. So could you tell us what you think if the takeaways for those key audiences in any order you'd like to take them?
Okay, so I think really there are 4 key takeaways. And one is to keep going with providing fundraising support, because in year 3, Homestart UK used 5 fundraising support associates who were invaluable. They are proven to raise far more than they cost. They are all very pro Homestart. Some of them had never come across Homestart before, but they're all quick learners. They don't only offer fundraising support, they also weigh in with help around governance and strategy and business planning and other things. And that group of people has such a lot to offer to little organizations who can't afford to employ a fundraiser. It would be, it would be meaningless, but they could perhaps afford to pay for a day or two of a support associate's time. And in a day or two, these support associates can achieve a phenomenal amount, a really phenomenal amount. And maybe Homestart UK could keep a little pot of money for local organizations who really just don't have enough funds even for that, to offer that help and support. So that's thing number 1. Thing number 2 is to investigate the reported difficulties in recruiting and retaining volunteers. Volunteering wasn't the focus of this evaluation, so we didn't have enough evidence to talk about how big this problem is across local home starts, but enough came up to support a recommendation to investigate that further, because of the local home starts that now have paid workers supporting families in ways that would previously have been done by volunteers, because they simply can't get enough volunteers. And I think there's all sorts of reasons: people having to work longer before they get their pension. So you've lost a whole chunk of people who might have started volunteering at 60, and maybe by 67, when they do retire, they're perhaps not so able or don't have so much time or just want a rest. That's just one thing. I think there could be all sorts of reasons, but it would be worth finding out more about that. And also a third one is around succession planning, because there is this situation in small organizations that if one person leaves suddenly, I heard about people who just died, and then that's a horrendous thing to happen, and everybody's in pieces and colleagues are in pieces, and it's really difficult to kind of backfill that person's position when they're not there anymore. Or people who become unwell and have to be off for a long time. And for volunteers as well, volunteers can just leave and may do so for personal reasons, sometimes after a very long period of very dedicated service, and then something happens in their life and they just have to pay more time and attention to their family, or they decide to move abroad, or whatever it is, their partner moves abroad, all sorts of things can happen. But someone leaving suddenly can be quite disastrous, or even someone leaving in a planned way, giving in notice and then leaving 4 weeks later, can be disastrous. But plans for managing this seem to be a bit the exception rather than the rule. So that's something that Homestart could take forward. And the fourth thing is to develop the culture of learning and sharing practice. At the end of year 2, we recommended that Homestart UK should build a culture of learning and sharing practice. In fact, that got fast-tracked because of the pandemic, with all of the webinars and so on. But there's still room for developing that and putting it on a more solid footing, and also thinking about how to work with that when we get back to the point where we can actually physically spend time together and travel again. I'm sure we'll do more online. I mean, the pandemic has benefited local home starts in some ways. They've been able to reach families they wouldn't otherwise reach by offering everything online, although clearly there are some things that can't be offered online. I mean, it's hard to do a baby massage class online, I've discovered. But there are pluses, and I hope that as we come out of the pandemic, we'll all keep the pluses. but then work out how to dovetail those pluses in with a more in-person relational, in presence kind of way of working that we used to love, I think.
Brilliant. Thank you, Helen. That's such a great wrap of all the learning from the report. Actually, there's so much in there, and I do recommend that everyone reads the report properly. But I was taken by your question that you said you asked at the towards the end of your interviews, that you said, is there anything else you'd like to share or talk about from your experiences?
Well, yes, I'd like to go back to what you said about the relational, and I do think that Home Start UK, essentially modelling the Home Start culture for local home starts, has proved much, much more effective than trying to bring in a different kind of culture, a more businessy culture. I can see why people did that, why people thought it was a good idea. There was evidence for that being a good idea. It came from suggestions from the network, but it didn't work. And I think sticking with and developing the relational, supportive, helpful, caring culture of Home Start is going to, well, has already massively improved relations between Home Start UK and local home starts, but also it's a kind of modelling thing that Home Start UK is doing and can do, and everybody seems to fit more comfortably with that and sit more comfortably within it. And I think that's why the fundraising support associates meshed in so well, because they all embody those values too, and they all bring those values to their work. I mean, some of them were telling me about, and local home starts were telling me about, how the support associates were keeping in contact even after their paid time had finished, because they wanted to see a bid through, make sure if a local home start got to the second stage, for example, that they could continue to support them to make sure they got the money. These are really dedicated people, as well as being very knowledgeable. They're dedicated and they're caring, and those are Home Start values. And I think I've tried to bring those values also into the evaluation as much as I've been able. I think one of the great myths about evaluation, certainly a myth in the third sector, is that people who do it are impartial. I'm independent of Home Start, and that's helpful, but no way am I impartial. I'm totally in favour of Home Start. I think Home Start's great. And I said that at the start, I said, I'm not pretending to be neutral here. That would be really ridiculous. That would mean me putting on an act. I'll be independent and I'll tell you as best I can what I think you need to know. But I am completely in favour of this organisation and I want to support it. And I'm glad to have been able to do so through this evaluation work. So thank you for having me.
Helen, that's lovely. Thank you. What a lovely note to end on. It's a brilliant piece of work. Thank you for helping us with it. A complicated project, but one that I think did have good value, and we learned a lot along the way. And so thank you for all your efforts into it. And I know, like those consultants and supports associates that you describe, I certainly know you put in more hours than you were ever asked to. So thank you. Brilliant stuff.
My pleasure.
And so you can see the report. We will make that available online. And if you're looking for a good evaluator, then I highly recommend Dr. Helen Kara. Thank you very much.
Peter, I'm very busy.
Yeah, exactly. Excellent. Well, thank you, and we'll speak again soon.
Thank you.